Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal's SSCP certification video training course. And in this video lesson, I'm going to be talking about malicious code. This is going to be a really fun and pretty quick lesson because we're going to go over all those software-based bad guys that you're going to see. And I'm going to talk about real-world events in the news and even show you how you could theoretically put on a black hat and do a big DDoS attack. First, let's talk about the different ways that malware can infect PCs or other devices. Up first, the Trojan Horse. Trojan horses generally pretend to be some piece of useful software, but then when you install them, they also install something else. Or maybe they're not useful software at all, but they're simply masquerading as something that you might want. At its simplest, this is just a malware executable file that's been renamed to something that you might want, like Game of Thrones Season 3.exe. And you think you're going to get a TV show, and you double click on it, and it does something terrible to your computer. Install malware, of course. At its sneakiest, it is some legitimate software. Maybe it's a game or a calculator app or a media player, and you install it, but at the same time, it also installs some toolbar. Maybe you even technically agreed to it because you'd have to have scrolled through the wizard or selected some non-default option, and it installs it anyway. There is some point when malware can kind of be a hazy area. Technically, it's not malware if the installer tells you what it's going to do. So it could install an app that says, all right, I'm going to let anybody spy on your computer, and in exchange, you get to play this really cool solitaire game. Well, that's not a deal many people would make, but if it's buried in the license agreement or if it's some option that isn't shown by default, well, you know what's going to happen. Most people are just going to select it. I actually have a little bit of resentment towards the Java group because they always release updates to Java, and every single time I want to install one of their stupid updates, they try to trick me into installing some toolbar like the Ask toolbar or something I've never even heard of. And no, I don't ever want it, but it buries it like 5 pages into the installation wizard and it's selected by default. So that's not technically a Trojan horse because they're technically telling you that they're going to install it, but I think it falls in that gray area. Drive-bys have been a really common way to spread malware nowadays. A drive-by is a website that has some code on it that will execute malware on your computer. Now, technically, your browser should never just install random software from a website without first confirming it with you. But these websites will contain specially formed code that will exploit a vulnerability in your browser. And I know what you're thinking, I'm safe from this because I don't visit sneaky or dirty websites. I just keep it clean and I go to Facebook and Reddit and the popular, well-known sites. Certainly, they're not going to be putting malware on my computer. It doesn't necessarily work that way. Websites will get hacked, and they'll be completely legit websites run by well-meaning people. But some piece of software on the website will go out of date. Maybe it's an older version of WordPress that has a known vulnerability. An attacker creates an exploit that breaks into that website and doesn't take it down, but just adds a little bit of malicious code to the end of the page. The website administrators will probably not even notice it because the website seems to continue functioning. But whenever you visit it, well, it's going to be a little bit of JavaScript code probably that will hack into your browser and install some software. So you can get drive-by malware by having your computer completely up to date and browsing nothing but safe websites. And I say this from experience because it's happened to me. As you might have noticed, I'm kind of into computer security stuff, but I've had malware installed on my computer through a drive-by, and I had every single update installed, and I visited only the cleanest of websites. And I still don't know exactly what website it came from, but I'm confident that's how it got on there. So it really can happen to anybody. Now, I will tell you how to avoid these types of problems in another lesson. Another popular way malware spreads is a worm. Now, worms attack your computer directly. You don't have to visit a web page or try to launch some application. Your computer is just sitting there quietly, but turned on and probably connected to the network. A worm just continually scans the network, the local network, it can be remote networks on the internet, looking for hosts with a vulnerability that it knows how to exploit. Often they can exploit hundreds of different vulnerabilities, so if your computer's not patched, it'll probably be caught by one of those. Once it finds a vulnerability it can exploit, it just sends a copy of itself and forces it to run on the remote computer, escalating privileges. Then once it's running on the remote computer, that computer starts doing the same thing, searching for other computers to install itself on. So that's how worms spread. It's very involuntary. You don't need to be accessing your computer at all. Humans are completely bypassed because it's generally exploiting software-based vulnerabilities. Viruses were the way most malware spread back in the 90s, but nowadays viruses just aren't all that common. Back in the 90s, Word viruses were really common. You'd have a Word document with a .doc file extension, and, well, Word documents supported macros. And these macros were little bits of code, not unlike a JavaScript, but not in JavaScript. And these macros would allow you to do different things like create a mailing list or print out a bunch of labels, that type of thing. Fortunately, attackers learned how to write macros that did bad things, like copy the same macro to a bunch of other documents. If they wrote a macro that managed to spread itself, well, that would be considered a virus. And in the early years, these viruses were all completely benign. All they did was copy themselves to a bunch of files. I really think they were probably created by just curious hackers who wanted to see if it could be done. They wanted to understand the theory behind it. It's almost the way that life evolves. Because it was able to persist, it persisted and flourished. But it didn't necessarily do anything malicious. At some point, somebody figured out, hey, we've got this mechanism down, let's give it a payload. And this payload would do something like send your files off to some server on the internet or cause your computer to crash. And nowadays on the internet, malware is often very profit-based. So we start to see more actual ways to extract money or something else out of you. We'll cover that later in this lesson. So the primary way that viruses spread is by infecting files. They attach themselves as a payload to something else. And in the early days, it was often Word files or PowerPoint files. But nowadays, it can be just about anything. Viruses have been attached to media files, and then when you go to play a video or a piece of music using a particular player, well, the media will have something encoded in it, something that probably exploits a buffer overrun vulnerability in the media player, and that will allow it to run malware on your computer. It can also be an email attachment. Email filters have gotten much better, so nowadays they pretty much hide any attachments that could possibly be executable. But, back in the day, these email attachments would often seem to have a legitimate extension. They could look like a Word file or just a text file or a piece of music, but it actually was an executable file of one type or another. So you'd think, oh, my friend's latest song, I do want to hear this song, and you double click the song, and then you have a virus, and it starts sending it out to everybody else that you know. Nowadays, I think the most common way for viruses to be spread is through peer-to-peer networking. Things like BitTorrent and news groups and the different ways that people share files. Often this is illegal content, pirated content. And because there's no authority who's monitoring these files and verifying the integrity of them, it's very easy for viruses to sneak into these files, and that's one of the reasons that you need to avoid those sorts of communities. Malware can also spread simply through media. Things like USB drives. Some operating systems will automatically run a particular file that's stored on a USB drive. So if you just plug that USB drive into some operating systems, well, the malware will just run automatically. Sometimes it prompts the user first, but if the user thinks it's going to be something nice and they run it anyway, well, the effect is the same. You can also infect a computer with malware by restarting the computer with a USB drive or other type of flash drive attached. Many computers are configured to automatically boot from a USB drive because it would probably be a recovery drive or an operating system installation drive. That's the intention anyway. But you load up one of those things with malware and you can plug it into any computer that you have physical access to, force a reboot, and then that computer is yours forever. You can install a bootkit or a firmware rootkit, and it will generally be completely undetectable to the operating system, and you'll be able to continue abusing that computer however you want. So for that reason, it's really important to protect media running on your computer, but I'll cover the countermeasures more in a later lesson. So now that I've covered the major ways that malware spreads, let's talk about the different types of malware. Spyware is kind of old school malware. This is the first type of malware that used to come about, and in fact, anti-malware used to simply be called anti-spyware because that's what everybody was concerned about. By definition, spyware steals some confidential information from your computer and sends it off to somebody else who might want to do something with it. So this would include anything that somebody could profit from, really. Credit card numbers, bank account numbers, your social security numbers, username and passwords that they could use to log into websites or other systems using your credentials, confidential documents that they might be able to profit from or sell, personal pictures, things that they might be able to get you to pay to have removed from the internet. I think the number one thing the data gathered by spyware is used for is simply credit card fraud. They get a credit card number and, well, that's really easy to sell. They'll bundle up hundreds of credit card numbers, thousands of credit card numbers, and sell them to criminals who will just use a variety of different techniques to turn those credit card numbers into money. More sophisticated attackers will actually invest in identity theft. So they'll get some information about you, your social security number, your bank account numbers, and then they'll use it to open up new accounts, take out credit in your name, maybe even get a home mortgage, that type of thing. Basically, it's just another way to take personal information and turn it into money. Finally, spyware is sometimes used for extortion. So if they find some of those personal pictures that you wouldn't want to share, they say, hey, if you want these not to be sent to all of your Facebook friends, then maybe send us a few dollars. Here's an example of recent spyware in the news. Korean hackers installed spyware on hundreds, thousands of different computers using some of the techniques I discussed earlier in this lesson. And they used it specifically to watch people who were playing poker. So malware, once it's installed on your computer, has pretty unlimited access to your computer, including just being able to capture a screenshot. So they go into an online poker game where people gamble money while they play cards, and they could actually see the person's cards. And this would allow them to bet against the person with a little bit of additional information, giving them a competitive edge. Now, everybody knows you can't win every time in poker, even if you know your opponent's hand, but it definitely lets you win most of the time. So they were able to make a great deal of money, but it didn't end well for them. 33 people were arrested as part of this ring in July of 2010. So I'm glad we tracked those guys down and got them off the internet. But there will be other people using these same techniques. And in fact, I'm sure there are hundreds of people out there doing this kind of thing now without anybody knowing about it. Another common type of malware is adware. There are organizations on the internet who will pay you just to display ads. They generally pay some tiny, tiny amount to display some random ad, like you might get a penny for every 10,000 views. There are also organizations who will pay per click. So if you can get a user to click through to an ad to actually visit a website, you can get some larger amount of money, sometimes a penny or two. And finally, there are websites that offer associate payments, where you basically get a commission if somebody actually clicks through and then buys a product. And from a commission, you can actually get several dollars. So there are these different ways to monetize people's attention, either by having them look at ads, click on ads, or actually purchase a product. And because there's a way to monetize it, well, that's an opportunity to be exploited. And people who don't have strong ethics take malware techniques and create software called Adware, which, against the user's wishes, displays ads to them. Sometimes it will replace ads on existing websites. My mother-in-law came to me the other day and she says, wow, I like Facebook, but I can't believe the ads that they show on Facebook. They're really scandalous. There were naked people in my Facebook ads. And I said, Facebook does not show naked people in ads, Christine. And sure enough, I did a scan on her computer and she had some adware in it. So this particular adware was trying to direct people over to some pornographic website. And it's common for companies that will be paying for clicks to malware providers to also be advertising something fairly scandalous. And for that reason, it can be really easy to recognize. After all, Amazon pays people to click through and purchase products, and Google Ads pays people every time they click on an ad. So why wouldn't a malware manufacturer use Amazon associate links or Google ad links? Well, because they wouldn't allow it. Of course, Google and Amazon, being big and reputable companies, don't work with adware or malware creators. So malware creators are forced to go into the underworld, and they tend to be advertising, pirating software or pornography or drugs or something like that, and basically trying to trick you to click through to it. Some types of adware will monitor what you're doing. So if you're searching for a book online, maybe you're looking for the wonderful photography book, Stunning Digital Photography, and you might find it and go to click through to a link on Amazon where you could buy it. Well, it might direct you to a different bookstore instead. This type of adware will actively monitor links and redirect you from well-known places to competitive places who are willing to give the malware creator a little bit of a kickback. Scareware is genuinely scary. Scareware works by manipulating the user's emotions. They make them think that something terrible will happen to them, generally if they don't buy something. So I'll show you a couple of examples on the next slides, but often they want you to buy anti-malware. A window will pop up and say, oh my goodness, your computer has malware on it. We can remove it. You just have to buy this legit looking anti-malware software. And I always crack up about this one because everything about it is correct. Like there is malware on your computer. It's the malware that's telling you there's malware on your computer. And when you're buying anti-malware, you're really just paying to have the malware remove itself. Another way Scareware works is by tricking you into paying a fine for something scandalous that you might have done. So they don't necessarily know that you've done anything scandalous, but they just take a chance. And so they'll say something like, hey, this is the RIAA, and we notice that you're pirating music. We can take you to court, or you could just pay $50 now and promise you won't do it again and we'll be done with it. Well, of course, it's not the RIAA. They don't work like that. They work through legal channels. And of course, they don't actually know that you were pirating music or doing whatever it is that they accused you of. But if you're feeling guilty about it and you're worried about some sort of legal action that they're threatening you with, well, you might go ahead and pay. And that's quick money for the malware creator, even though you get absolutely nothing out of it. Another way Scareware works is to say, hey, look, we just found all of your tax documents and your personal pictures, and if you'd like to keep this private, well, please give us a few dollars. It can also create new pictures of you. I never like to leave a webcam connected on my computer because they will just take pictures with your webcam. And frankly, I work from home and I spend half the day in my robe, and I don't want pictures like that on the internet. And you never know when your computer is going to get hacked. But it is common practice to turn on the mics on the computer and turn on the webcam and just record you doing stuff. And then it captures it to the computer, maybe stores it in a remote location, and they say, send us some money or we will make this public. Here's a screenshot of some scareware. Oh my goodness, the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the DOJ and the FBI, they've locked my computer because, let's see what this one does. It says I've been visiting websites containing pornography, child pornography, zoophilia, and child abuse. My computer contains video files, blah, blah, blah. Spam messages with terrorist motives were also sent from your computer. So they basically just list everything super scary and hope that they hit on something that I might be worried about. And of course, they make it really easy to resolve. I just need to pay a fine of $200 and all this goes away because, of course, you know that's how law enforcement works. They catch you doing federal offenses, felonies, multiple cases of felonies, and there's no court system involved or arrest or Miranda rights. No, that's the way the DOJ and the FBI works. They just want you to pay $200 and then go on with your life. No, of course this is not the DOJ or the FBI. It's a moderately clever malware manufacturer who's tricking people who are not educated about the legal process. You can see here they put a false time constraint. You have 72 hours to pay the fine, otherwise you will be arrested. And then they, of course, need some way to get the money from you to them. And you can't just write them a check or put in your credit card number because that would be traceable back to them. So they have these other techniques of getting money out of you. Money pack, and sometimes they'll have you send money through Western Union or some similar service. Anyway, they want to get actual cash in their hand and they need it to be untraceable back to them. So that makes paying them a little bit hard, thankfully. You will get people coming to you saying, oh my God, I just got this awful thing and you know what, I have to confess I did do something wrong. You can let them rest assured that it's not the actual DOJ or FBI. They just need some anti-malware. Here's another good one. This is from the Metropolitan Police. I don't know, metropolitan just means city, right? So that seems kind of generic. And then they try to show some personal information about you, like your IP address. Like, oh my goodness, they know my IP address. And of course, they accuse you of doing all the same types of things. Oh my goodness. Websites, oh, I won't even read those things, but yes, they accuse you of doing awful, illegal things. And of course, the way that you rectify this isn't by doing jail time or going to court, but it's by paying money through some skeevy way of paying money that you've never heard of, like ePay, Payzone. I've never heard of these things. Clearly they're not legit because these malware manufacturers are using them. Those are both real screenshots. One of these screenshots is from malware called Reviton, which was popular from 2011 to 2012. Scary window pops up and it won't close. It's telling you you've done awful things, you have to pay law enforcement, and it can be easily removed. You can just go to a different computer, since your computer is locked, and type in instructions to remove it, and it's really easy to follow, and the malware is gone forever. Actually wasn't all that sophisticated of malware. It can certainly be more difficult to remove malware than Reviton was. But it was successful as scareware because it raised millions and millions of dollars. People saw that scary pop-up, and sure enough, they went through the trouble to actually pay. Recently in 2013, 12 were arrested in Spain for creating and running and profiting from Reviton. But like I said, they managed to get millions of dollars a year, and I imagine they probably didn't get everybody. Another common type of malware is called ransomware. And here they're not accusing you of doing anything terrible, but it is like scareware in that they're telling you you won't be able to get to your files ever unless you pay us some money. Often they actually encrypt the files on your local PC so that you can't decrypt them until you pay for the decryption key. Sometimes your files aren't really encrypted and you can simply reboot the computer and bypass it. The first thing that I would recommend anybody do is just to shut down the computer and then reboot it from a Linux live CD or live flash drive, something that will allow you to inspect the files. And if you see your files, well, first make sure they're backed up and then reinstall your operating system and restore your files. So the studies show that about 3% of users actually pay ransomware to get their files decrypted. So that's not a great success rate if you're running a legit business, but it doesn't cost them much at all to distribute this malware. So the malware manufacturers just try to distribute it to hundreds of thousands, millions of people, and they get some tiny amount of return from those, but it's still enough to make a profit because their overhead is so low. Now, actually paying for ransomware doesn't actually mean you get your files back. Frankly, the malware manufacturers are a little more interested in the upfront sales process than they are in the actual file recovery process. Frankly, once they get their money, they don't care about you because there's no customer service. It's not like you're going to go on Amazon or Craigslist and write a review about them and say, this ransomware manufacturer didn't have great customer service and I paid to get my files back, but they didn't restore them promptly. No, there's no review system for them, so they don't care. Once you pay, they're done with you. Some ransomware actually will restore your files, but if it were me, I would not ever take the chance. Just scrap the computer, reformat, do whatever you have to do to clean it, and then restore from backup. Rootkits and bootkits are really just a different way for malware to infect your computer. Both of these techniques start before your actual operating system, and therefore they start before any anti-malware software runs. Therefore, they can completely hide from the anti-malware because they launch first, and then when the anti-malware starts, they can monitor the anti-malware. And if they see that the anti-malware is going to check a particular file that they've infected, well, they just provide a different copy of the file, a clean copy of the file to the anti-malware. This allows the rootkit or bootkit to completely camouflage itself on the system, especially with firmware rootkits, which embed themselves in literally the motherboard of the computer. They can be literally impossible to remove. I've covered these techniques in other lessons in more detail, so I won't review too much here. Now let's talk about something that has become a big deal in the last few years, botnets. Sometimes they're called zombies or zombie armies. Now, I tried to get a good estimate of how many computers out there are controlled by this botnet software, and the best I could come up with is 200 million PCs. That's a big number though, right? That's a lot of different computers running this botnet software. So botnet software is malware that's installed on a computer, but it allows the computer to just keep running. In fact, it generally doesn't interact with the user in any way. Instead, the way people profit from it is they can run code on your computer to do different things. I'll cover the types of things that they do with botnets on the next slide. Botnet masters have a certain number of computers that their botnet software is running on. And, it used to be these botnets became huge, 500,000, 1 million, more than 1 million different computers in a single botnet. But that actually made them pretty easy to track down and fix because all of these botnets need to communicate in some way in order to receive commands from the master. So because these really large botnets got tracked down and broken up based on their communications, the average network size now is about 20,000 computers. So still, having the ability to control 20,000 different PCs gives you an awful lot of computing power and an awful lot of internet bandwidth. So you can still do a lot of awful things. And you can do the math yourself, but if the average network size is about 20,000 computers and there are 200 million PCs infected, well, that means that there are about 1,000 different botnets out there. Realistically, the number would be higher because some computers will have software from multiple different botnets on them. So of those 200 million PCs, many of them will participate in 5 or 6 different botnets. I should reinforce, people don't know that this software is running on their computer. It gets installed just like malware in some sneaky way, and it never interrupts what they're doing. So they don't necessarily ever notice it. The idea of the botnet isn't to interrupt the user or to get some money from the user, but just to borrow their computer when they're not actively using it. If you were to let the user know that it was there, well, the user would probably take steps to clean up their computer, and thus the computer would no longer be useful to you. So the botnet software is motivated to keep itself silent and hidden. Back in the 90s, malware often was motivated just by curiosity and people wanted to kind of prove that they could distribute their malware to a certain number of computers. But nowadays, every malware I see is motivated by money. People want to monetize something, especially in third world and second world countries. Malware is often the most efficient way to make a buck, kind of a sad fact. So as we look at the different ways that botnets are used, almost all of it is different ways to make money. One of the common things that we'll see are DDoS attacks. All the 20,000 computers in the network will send as much bandwidth, as many requests as they can to one particular IP address or all the IP addresses used by a particular website. And that prevents the website from handling legitimate requests, performing a denial of service attack. It's called a distributed denial of service attack because the requests are coming from many different computers, and that makes it much harder to block. And in fact, many DDoS attacks are pretty much impossible to block. They will just take your website offline, usually not for days or weeks, but for minutes or hours. So again, this has to be monetized. How do you make money from this DDoS capability? Well, you sell it. And on the next slide, I will show you exactly how you can purchase those services. Botnets are also used for sending spam. It's hard to send spam. You can't just connect your computer to the internet and send 1 million people an email because all the mail servers in the world would immediately recognize that you were sending out a bunch of spam and then they would block you and then your spam wouldn't get anywhere. So one of the things you can do is send spam from a bunch of different computers, maybe even a bunch of people's personal email accounts. If you have 20,000 computers, most of them will have some form of email client on them, and you can just use their personal account to send out some spam. So botnets are commonly used to distribute spam because it's easier to get it past the filters. Botnets are also used for proxies. An attacker who is sneaking through a system never wants it to be traced back to his home IP address. He's literally on a computer at his home with a public IP address that's immediately traceable back to his house. So he doesn't want somebody to ever see his IP address. So he'll log into one computer on a botnet and send all of his traffic through that computer. Better yet, he'll probably log into 5 different computers and bounce traffic through those 5 different computers. Because if he were to proxy through one computer, well, the FBI or whoever was tracking him down would immediately find the IP address of that botnet computer and then set up software to monitor the communications to the botnet computer and get it back to his house. So by bouncing things off of 5, 10, 15, 20 different computers, well, as you can imagine, communications get a little slow, but it makes the process of tracking it back to the origin IP a long and drawn-out process. And the attacker will be regularly moving from different computers, different proxies, so they're always using a different path, making it virtually impossible to track back to them. Lately, I've seen botnets used for Bitcoin generation. If you're not familiar with Bitcoin, it's an online form of currency not endorsed by any particular government, but it's actually pretty commonly used, and you can buy a lot of legit as well as illegitimate services with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a real currency that you can exchange for goods and services on the internet. It's a funny thing though, because you can simply run software on your computer to generate Bitcoins. That is how Bitcoins come into play. People just generate them using cryptographic algorithms. So why don't we all just run Bitcoin software and generate money? Well, it actually costs more in computing power and electricity to generate Bitcoins than the Bitcoins are worth. So it doesn't make financial sense to do that unless it's somebody else's computer and electricity. So you can get a botnet with 20,000 computers and run Bitcoin generation software on them, and you'll actually be making a profit on it. Somebody else will be paying. It's basically like every computer owner in the botnet is paying money into their electric bill that you're taking out in the form of Bitcoins. Another way botnets can make money is click fraud. I mentioned earlier how adware manufacturers use different pay-per-click advertising services to monetize the adware. Well, this can happen with botnets too. Different ad groups, for example, Google Ads, they watch for fraud really carefully because they'll pay for each time somebody clicks an ad. So, of course, they don't want somebody just sitting at their house and clicking an ad over and over again to make a bunch of money, right? In theory, you could do that. It's called click fraud. Now, Google happens to have really sophisticated algorithms that watch every click that comes in, and if they see one guy clicking over and over again, well, they figure it's click fraud, and they don't give that person any money. And if that person happens to own the Google Ads account that they're clicking to make money for, well, they'll just cancel his account. So Google has gotten really sophisticated with their algorithms, and they can now detect all sorts of different sorts of intelligent and distributed click fraud systems. For example, they might hire people all over the world to just click on ads and do it in such a way that it looks more legit. So it's not just one guy clicking the same ad over and over again, but the clicks seem to come from all over the world, and maybe these people even seem interested in the product. Well, if you do this with a botnet, you can fake these clicks from computers all over the planet and do it using patterns that might be difficult for the click fraud algorithms to pick up. So that's another way that botnets are used. Because botnets have access to the personal computer that they're running on, they can also use more common techniques, such as simply stealing financial information or serial numbers or product keys, credit card information, all of the other techniques that might be used by different types of malware. Botnets are also used for brute forcing. So if there's some piece of encrypted information that needs to be decrypted, well, modern computing power couldn't do that. But if you send it out to 20,000 computers, it can be done in a tangible amount of time. Finally, some botnet owners make money simply by selling the ownership of the botnet. They'll gather together 20,000 computers and then just sell access to all of those computers. They'll just, sometimes they lease it out. Oh, you can use it for a day or a week. Other times they'll just hand over permanent ownership so that you now own all those 20,000 computers, or at least a process running on those 20,000 computers. And now I'm going to visit a website where you can buy DDoS services. Really, they're called stress testing services. And I don't know exactly how any of these services are implemented, but I suspect some of them are implemented by using botnets. So here I am at Hackforums.net, and these are just forums for the gray hat and black hat community. I don't actually hang out here personally. I just kind of spy on what the other side is doing. Here I'll visit the marketplace link and visit their marketplace services where people sell primarily nefarious stuff. Now, the code word that we're looking for here is server stress testing. This is just a nice way of saying a DDoS attack. Now, I'll say stress testing is a legit service. If you want to make sure your website can handle millions of hits, you will use a stress test. However, that same stress test is a DDoS attack if you're not a willing participant in it. So these stress testing services, if they're directed to a website that you don't own, will take it offline, and therefore they're not actually a stress test anymore. They're a DDoS attack. So here's a particular service that has a good rating of 3 stars, and I'll click here. And we can see this company has made logos. They seem fairly professional. They have some information about the services that they offer here. You can see they offer either layer 4 attacks or layer 7 attacks, going back to that OC model. See why I wanted you to know it? They have customer support. It seems like a pretty legit service. You can see they allow paying by PayPal or Bitcoin. Let's go back and look at a different service. I want to see. Here's another service, and you can see this one brags about the amount of bandwidth that it's able to put out. And indeed, that is a pretty impressive amount of bandwidth. If this chart is legit, we're talking about 10 gigabits per second of bandwidth. And this would be all requests, basically. So that would certainly be enough to bring just about any website offline. Scrolling down a bit, we see that they offer different packages for what are basically DDoS attacks. The one-day trial here allows for 2 minutes of DDoS attacks and costs you only $1.50. I guess you really just do that if you want to make sure that it works the way you think. And beyond that, you can spend more to get a certain amount of DDoS attacks every month. So here we have 10 minutes of DDoS for only $10. That's a pretty good deal, right? So for $10, if this service is legit, you'd be able to bring down any individual's internet connection or a fairly large website for 10 minutes, which, you know, if it was a big website, that would be a really, really big deal. Anyway, there are dozens of different services like this that you can purchase for fairly small amounts of money and do bad things. And this is one of the things that botnets are abused for. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.